Imagine turning on the news and hearing that one of the world's largest economies has been quietly stockpiling a metal that most people completely ignore. Not gold, not oil, but silver, and not just a little bit. We're talking about hundreds, possibly thousands of tons, moved in the shadows, while the rest of the world was busy watching inflation data and stock market rallies. You're about to see evidence that suggests China has been secretly buying up massive quantities of silver. And almost nobody is talking about it. Welcome back to Macro Truth. And before we go any further, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why China wants all that silver and why it might be the single most underreported story in global finance today. Let's start with a simple question. Why would any country secretly buy silver? After all, silver isn't exactly rare. It's used in jewelry, tableware, and electronics. But here's where it gets interesting. Silver is also one of the most critical industrial metals on the planet. Every solar panel needs it. Every electric vehicle uses it. Every smartphone, every missile guidance system, every 5G tower, silver is inside all of them because it's the best conductor of electricity on Earth. And right now, China is racing to dominate every single one of those industries. But the official numbers don't add up. According to customs data, China imported about 350 million ounces of silver last year. That sounds like a lot until you realize that China's own industrial demand for silver is estimated to be closer to 600 million ounces. So where's the rest coming from? The answer, according to analysts who track these things, is that China has been quietly buying silver through third parties' offshore accounts, and even by recycling old electronics and mining waste inside its own borders. But even that doesn't fully explain the gap. Think about what's happening in the global silver market right now. For years, silver has been trading at prices that make no sense compared to gold. The gold to silver ratio has averaged around 50 to 1 for most of history, meaning 1 ounce of gold would buy 50 ounces of silver. But in recent years, that ratio has blown out to 80 or even 90 to 1. That means silver is historically cheap relative to gold. And if you're a country like China, looking to diversify your reserves away from US dollars and treasuries, buying silver makes perfect sense. But there's a problem. If China announced openly that it was going to start buying massive amounts of silver, the price would skyrocket overnight, and their strategic advantage would disappear. So they do it quietly. They use shell companies in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Switzerland. They buy through London's over-the-counter market where trades are private. And they ship the metal not just to Shanghai, but to warehouses in South Korea and Taiwan that are owned by Chinese state-controlled entities. Now, let me give you a specific example that really opens your eyes. Back in 2022, the United States and its allies froze nearly half of Russia's foreign currency reserves. That sent shockwaves through Beijing. Chinese officials realized that their own massive holdings of US treasuries could be frozen or even confiscated in a future conflict over Taiwan or trade. So they started accelerating their purchases of hard assets, things that can't be frozen digitally. Gold is the obvious choice, and China has been buying gold every month for over a year without reporting it publicly. But silver is even better in some ways. It's cheaper, it's easier to move discreetly, and it has far more industrial value. An ounce of silver can become a solar cell, a battery contact, or a circuit board. An ounce of gold just sits in a vault. So while the world watches central banks buy gold, Macro Truth is telling you that the real action is happening in silver, and China is leading the charge. Here's where the story gets even more fascinating. Look at the London bullion market, which is the world's largest silver trading hub. For years, there have been reports that silver inventories in London have been dropping steadily, even though mining production remains stable. In fact, in the first quarter of last year alone, London's silver vaults saw the largest quarterly decline in at least a decade. When reporters asked exchange officials what was happening, they gave vague answers about normal fluctuations. But private analysts who track shipping data noticed something strange. Huge quantities of silver bars labeled for industrial use were being sent to Asia, but not to Japanese or Indian buyers, to Chinese-owned warehouses in bonded zones. Then, those bars would disappear from customs records entirely. That's because once silver enters a bonded zone in China, it can be held indefinitely without being reported as an import. And from there, it can be moved into state reserves with no public announcement. You might be wondering, does this actually matter for regular people like you and me? The answer is yes, and here's why. Silver is not just an industrial metal, it's also money. For thousands of years, silver was used as currency alongside gold. The US dollar itself was originally defined as a certain weight of silver. Even today, silver coins are legal tender in several countries. So if China is quietly accumulating silver, they are effectively building a monetary reserve that exists outside the dollar system. And that has huge implications for the value of the dollar, for inflation, and for the price of everything you buy. Imagine a future where trade between major economies starts to settle in silver instead of dollars. That's not science fiction. It's already happening on a small scale between China, Russia, and Iran. And every ton of silver that China buys secretly makes that future more likely. Let's talk about the industrial angle again, because this is where the conspiracy becomes a no-brainer. China has set a goal to be carbon neutral by 2060. To get there, they need to build an insane amount of solar panels. I'm talking about enough solar capacity to power the entire United States twice over. Each solar panel contains about 2/3 of a gram of silver. That doesn't sound like much, but multiply that by billions of panels and you get hundreds of millions of ounces of silver just for solar. Then add electric vehicles. Every EV uses about 50% more silver than a gasoline car because of all the electrical contacts, switches, and battery management systems. China already makes more than half of the world's EVs. By 2030, they want to make 70% of them. Now add high-speed rail, 5G infrastructure, military drones, and smart grid technology. The total silver demand from Chinese industry alone could exceed 1 billion ounces per year within the next decade. But global silver mining only produces about 800 million ounces annually. So where does the extra come from? It comes from stockpiles. And if China has been secretly building those stockpiles for years, they will have a massive advantage when silver shortages start to bite everyone else. Now, I want you to think about how the Western financial media covers this story. Usually they don't. Occasionally, you'll see an article about silver being in a deficit, but it's always framed as a temporary supply issue or something that can be fixed by higher prices. Nobody asks the obvious question. Who is buying all the silver, and why are they buying it quietly? The closest thing we have to an answer comes from leaked documents and whistleblower accounts. For example, a former trader at a major bullion bank once told an investigator that his firm had been acting as a buyer for a large Asian sovereign wealth fund. The fund never wanted to take delivery of the silver in its own name, so the bank would buy futures contracts, take delivery, store the metal in its own vaults, and then transfer ownership weeks later through a maze of subsidiary companies. The trader said this went on for years and the total amount was staggering. He estimated the fund bought more than 50 million ounces a year this way, and that was just one of several similar operations. Let me connect some dots for you that most people miss. The price of silver is set in paper markets where traders buy and sell futures contracts. For every ounce of physical silver, there are hundreds of paper claims on that same ounce. This system works as long as nobody tries to take delivery of the actual metal. But if a big buyer like China starts taking delivery again and again, the paper market starts to crack. That's exactly what we've seen in recent years. Delivery notices on the Comex exchange have been surging. More people are demanding real silver bars instead of just settling in cash. And the ones who can afford to do that are usually large institutions with deep pockets, like state-owned entities. So the evidence is mounting. China is not just buying silver secretly, they're systematically draining the available physical supply from Western markets. And one day, maybe sooner than we think, the paper price will disconnect from the physical reality. That's when silver could explode in value, just like nickel did in 2022, when a short squeeze sent prices from $20,000 a ton to over $100,000 in less than 24 hours. Now, I know some of you are thinking, if this is such a big deal, why isn't the US government doing something about it? Well, that's the million-dollar question. The truth is, the US government is also a huge buyer of silver, but for very different reasons. The US Mint buys silver to make American Eagle coins, and the Department of Defense buys silver for all sorts of military hardware. But the scale is tiny compared to what China is doing. The real reason you don't hear alarms about this from Washington is that most policymakers are still thinking about the world the way it was 20 years ago. They assume the dollar will always be the world's reserve currency, that China will always want to buy US treasuries, and that commodity markets will always be liquid and transparent. But that world is changing fast, and by the time they wake up to what's happening in silver, the metal will already be in Chinese vaults, not American ones. Let's talk about what this means for you as an investor, or just as someone who wants to protect their savings. I'm not here to give financial advice, but I will tell you what Macro Truth has learned from studying these patterns. Throughout history, whenever a major power starts secretly stockpiling a commodity, it's usually because they expect that commodity to become more valuable in the future. Oil, grain, rare earths, all have been stockpiled quietly before price spikes. Silver is no different. But here's the twist. Silver is also a monetary metal, which means it can serve as a hedge against currency devaluation, bank failures, and geopolitical crises. So China gets a 2-for-1 deal. They secure the industrial inputs they need for their green energy and tech dominance, and they build an alternative reserve asset that can't be sanctioned or frozen. That is a brilliant strategic move, and it's happening right under our noses. You might be asking, okay, but if China is buying secretly, how can we be sure it's actually happening? Good question. Let's look at the official numbers from the Silver Institute, which tracks global supply and demand. Every year, they publish a report showing a deficit between silver production and consumption. In 2021, the deficit was about 50 million ounces. In 2022, it grew to 80 million. Last year, it was over 100 million. That means more silver is being used than mined. So where's the extra coming from? It has to come from above-ground inventories, like old jewelry, silverware, and bullion held by private investors. But those inventories are not infinite, and the rate at which they are being drawn down has accelerated sharply. The only logical explanation is that a large secret buyer is absorbing all the surplus. There are only a handful of entities in the world with the capital and the motivation to do that. China is at the top of that list. Now, let me share something that will really make you think. A few months ago, a Chinese state-owned enterprise quietly bought a controlling stake in one of the world's largest silver refineries, located in Peru. This refinery processes nearly 10% of global silver output. The deal was structured through a subsidiary in the Cayman Islands, and the price was never disclosed. When reporters asked the Peruvian government about it, they said they had no objection because the buyer promised to keep the refinery operating. But what happens to all that silver once it's refined? You guessed it, most of it gets shipped directly to China. And because the refinery is now owned by a Chinese entity, those shipments are considered internal transfers, not exports, so they don't show up in any international trade data. That's the definition of buying secretly. They don't need to sneak around in submarines or hide the metal in cargo containers. They just buy the entire source of supply, and then they move it under the cover of normal business operations. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a prediction. Not a guarantee, but a pattern that history shows us. When a nation secretly accumulates a strategic resource for years, there comes a moment when they no longer need to keep it secret. That moment is usually when the resource becomes scarce and prices start rising fast. At that point, they might announce their stockpile as a way to demonstrate power and influence. Imagine China revealing they have 500 million ounces of silver in reserve. The psychological impact on global markets would be enormous. It would signal to everyone that China is prepared for a post-dollar world, that they have real assets to back their economy, and that they are not afraid of sanctions. And then, countries that are currently neutral might start shifting their own reserves into silver, triggering a buying frenzy that pushes prices to levels nobody can predict today. That's the scenario that the people secretly buying silver right now are betting on. So here's where you come in. If you made it this far, you are part of a small percentage of people who actually understand what's happening in the global silver market. Most people will never hear this story because it doesn't fit the mainstream narrative. That's why I need your help. Drop a comment below and let me know your take. Do you think China is really buying silver secretly, or is this just another conspiracy theory? And if you found value in this video, do me a huge favor and share it with one person who needs to know the truth. Not 10 people, just one. Because that's how real information spreads, one person at a time. And while you're at it, make sure you've liked and subscribed to Macro Truth so you don't miss the next deep dive. We've got a lot more coming on gold, oil, rare earths, and the quiet moves that are reshaping global power. Thanks for watching. Stay curious and remember, the truth is usually hiding in plain sight. You just have to know where to look.